What's up, ladies and gents? It's Drew here, and welcome back to a brand new FudgeMuppet Skyrim Remastered build. If you're wondering who this mysteriously refreshing voice is, I strongly recommend you check out the third member of FudgeMuppet video, which is linked in the description below. In the description, you'll also find the link to the second episode of our epic Fallout Redemption story series. It's seriously good stuff, if I must say so myself, so be sure to check it out. Looking at this menacing Orc Warchief here, we've taken our old backstory, role-playing, playstyle, and even the skill set, and given it a very effective makeover. The Orc Warchief may not be the prettiest guy in Skyrim, but it'd be hard to argue that he isn't the meanest and the toughest. After learning to wield a warhammer and maneuver in heavy armor from an incredibly young age, the Orc Warchief could take down entire armies in one of his rafts. The Warchief hates anyone who dismisses him for his race or appearance, and he makes them suffer for it. He uses his imposing strength to protect those who are discriminated against, especially his fellow Orsimer. Armed with a mighty Daedric artifact of Malakath, Volendrung, nothing can stand in his way. For more information on how you can get your green hands on this devastating weapon, you should venture down to the description, where you'll be able to follow a link to our good friend Camelworks channel. There you'll find a brand new guide on Volendrung that tells you absolutely everything about it and why it's so cool. Also, if you want to have your say on which build we remaster next, cast your vote in the comments. Thumb up either the Shield Maiden or the Monster Hunter. Now, let's get into the Orc Warchief's racial abilities, standing stone, and stats. The Orc Warchief, believe it or not, is an orc, and he leads his life under the guidance of the Daedric prince Malakath. As an orc, the Warchief has the ability to use his Berserker Rage. With Berserker Rage, he takes half damage and does double damage for 60 seconds. He'll also be naturally gifted with plus 10 heavy armor, plus 5 block, plus 5 enchanting, plus 5 smithing, and plus 5 two-handed, which will all be very handy for this build's playstyle, skills, and perks. Early on, the Warchief will use the Warrior Stone to advance his skills, which predominantly fall under the Warrior category. Later on, the Atronach Stone provides some great anti-mage protection. With this stone, he'll have 50% spell absorption. The other two effects don't impact him, as he uses no magicka, but the spell absorption alone is enough to make it completely worthwhile. The Warchief's stat spread will be 80% health and 20% stamina. He is an absolute tank on the battlefield, and 80% investment into health will ensure you're never worrying about your health bar. As for the 20% of stamina, this will go to use with the Orc Warchief's aggressive combat approach. The low investment here is justified by the various enchantments, perks, and weapon effects which will come into play later on. But before we look at those, let's learn about the Warchief's backstory, role-playing, and factions. The Orc Warchief was the third son of a renowned, prestigious Orc leader. His father was the original Warchief, and they resided in a stronghold nestled in the eastern hills of High Rock, much to the annoyance of the surrounding Breton lords. The third son was considered a prodigy among the tribe folk. He was a mighty warrior and could effectively wield a warhammer in one hand at only 14 years of age. They lived a typical Orc lifestyle, valuing strength and courage above all else, hunting and living off the land. As is often the case with Orc settlements, the surrounding humans weren't pleased with their presence. One particular lord, who held dominion over the lands just east of the Orcs, could see the smoke rise from the Orc stronghold every evening when he walked the ramparts of his castle. Lord Randall was just like any wealthy Breton lord, with a proud posture and overly high opinion of himself. Randall would stroke the hilt of his longsword as he leaned over the parapet of his western wall, overlooking the Orc stronghold with an expression of sheer disgust on his entitled face. Randall was relentlessly hatching ploys to drive the Orcs from their homes so that he could expand his control over the land and rid it of this blemish. He planned to sabotage the Orc crops, causing much of the agriculture to die as if by the will of nature, and he sent his men to hunt as much of the game in the nearby forests as possible, hoping that eventually the Orcs would be starved and forced to leave. The original Orc Warchief began to grow suspicious of this, but instead of surrendering to the stronghold, he tightened the allowance of their extensive supply of rations. The Orcs were prepared for a war of attrition. They persevered, continuing to occupy their stronghold, not rising to Lord Randall's provocations. Eventually, the Breton lords tried a new approach. One morning, when the Orcs were sharpening their weapons for the day's hunt, a young messenger stalked nervously to the stronghold gates. He held a square of white cloth above his head and a rolled parchment in the other hand. The letter was penned by Lord Randall himself, inviting the Orc Warchief and his selected councillors to meet and arrange terms of a possible trade venture between the stronghold and his dominion. Randall suggested that the Orc smithing skill could be traded in exchange for his advanced agriculture. The Warchief scoffed, skeptical of this sudden diplomatic approach from the bigoted lord, but he accepted the offer as since the suspected sabotage, the Orcs' agriculture had been diminishing. He began organising a group of his most capable fighters, were things to go south. He left his two firstborn sons in charge of guarding the stronghold, but took his young thirdborn along for the encounter. He hoped to provide him with some useful battle experience. They set off the following morning. The letter had said that they would meet in a local farmhouse. The Warchief suspected that this was so the meeting wouldn't become public knowledge beyond beyond those trusted to attend, so he thought nothing of it. The Warchief, tailed by his son and his 5 best soldiers, opened the heavy wooden door to the farmhouse and stepped inside. They had arrived first, so they took up a spot facing the door from the far end of the farmhouse. The Warchief rested a hand on his warhammer vigilantly, while his son was slightly less subtle, eagerly anticipating whatever was about to go down. The farmhouse door began to creak, and they saw a gauntleted arm gripping the door handle. Rather than opening wide, it closed with an oaky thump, and they heard the sound of chains barring the door. The Warchief called out in startled anger, but his words faded as they began to smell the sickening aroma of smoke. The farmhouse was being set alight in 20 different places. The wooden building, which was filled with hay and stacked firewood, was up in flames in moments. The orcs drew their weapons and began frantically swinging great axes and warhammers at the walls. After the initial hysteria passed, the Warchief organised his men in a controlled attack on one side of the farmhouse. The fire-weakened timber gave way just before the smoke fumes left them unconscious, and one by one they scrambled out of the hole in the wall. The first orc to breach the wall was immediately taken by an arrow to the chest, causing a roar of anger from the others. The Warchief gripped his third son by the shoulder and rolled his other hand into a fist, gesturing through the chaos for him to show his might for the good of his kin. The 6 remaining orcs burst out of the wall at once, just before the farmhouse came crashing down, and momentarily they overwhelmed the Breton betrayers. But they were greatly outnumbered. The Warchief led the charge, thrashing his enormous hammer into the chest of the closest Breton knight, shattering his chestplate as his ribs caved in. His son followed suit, using his warhammer against humans for the first time. Despite his youth, he was far more skilled than his opponents. Fueled by youthful confidence, he took down knight after knight. The tide of battle turned, and the orcs were struck down one by one. On his knees, the Warchief screamed at his son to return to the stronghold and to lock the gates. He hesitated, almost running back into the fray to save his father. But as he took the first step, a blade thrusted through his father's back. The former Warchief's eyes widened in pain and shock, and the blood-spattered blade twisted, securing the kill. Without waiting a moment longer, the Orc Warchief turned and ran into the forest, barreling as fast as he could muster towards the stronghold. Randall's man came to him after the battle was through and pointed at the fleeing Warchief. Lord Randall decided to leave him, knowing he had nowhere to go but to his demise. When the Warchief returned to the stronghold, he could see the corpses of his kin scattered on the ground, painted red by the blood and innards strewn everywhere. Inside were 3 worn-out Breton soldiers, collecting loot from the fallen, the rest of the force having moved on. The Warchief dropped to his knees, overcome with grief. His pain festered and turned to fury. He got to his feet, picked up a large rock from the ground, and sprinted towards the camp. Inside, one of the surviving Bretons, a battle mage, saw his advance and began charging a fireball. Without breaking stride, he grabbed a wooden chair and launched it at the spell. The chair exploded into 1,000 smouldering splinters. Through the smoke, the Warchief pounced on the mage, driving the rock through his skull. He instinctively drew the mage's sword and turned his sights on the other 2 knights. He thrust the sword into the first knight's chest, breaking the Breton's defense effortlessly and killing him instantly. He used his momentum to push the skewered body of the first soldier into the other, pinning them against the far wall. The pinned knight struggled frantically as the Warchief drew his giant warhammer. Ignoring the pleas of the helpless Breton, the Warchief swung horizontally, crushing both knights' skulls. All that remained in the stronghold was the smell of death and the cries of carrion crows as they fed on the deceased. With nothing but the cloves on his back and the warhammer in his hands, the Warchief made his escape before the reinforcements arrived. For the next 2 years, the Orc Warchief worked on a farm, grinding grain in the mill and chopping wood. One day, news broke of a great Breton campaign to Cyrodiil, where the greatest knights were going to meet the Emperor. Among those travelling was Lord Randall himself. The Warchief paid his respects to the kind Breton farmer who fed and sheltered him for so many years, packed his few possessions and headed out in search of Randall. He eventually caught up to the chain of carriages. There were so many banners, soldiers and carriages that he couldn't possibly miss them. He followed patiently, waiting for the opportune moment, which came on the border of Skyrim and Cyrodiil. He infiltrated the armory tent when the party set up for the evening and garbed himself in Lord Randall's colours, his head covered by the signature helmet of Randall's guards. He then posed as one of the Lord's guards. When Randall excused himself to use the chamber pot, the Warchief drew his hidden knife and followed him in. Lord Randall looked up, angered at his guard's audacity. The Warchief tuned out the Lord's berating, walking closer to the vulnerable half-naked man, and thrust his knife through Randall's throat. As he did so, he heard the dead man void his bowels, and he laughed, choosing this time to make his departure. He tore through the tent with his knife and stalked into the darkness. Just as he thought he'd made his escape, he was captured by a group of Imperials. As an orc, the Orc Warchief knows all about being ostracized. Even in his home in High Rock, people hated him and his kin, and he had been forced to abandon his previous life, losing everyone he loved in the process. After escaping Helgen, he decides to devote himself to Malakath and his teachings. He'll aim to replicate Malakath's love for combat prowess, his honour, and his sense of responsibility to protecting those who are shunned, especially the Orsimer. He'll help the orcs wherever he can and will continue to prove his strength despite not being part of his old tribe anymore. In regards to factions, the Orc Warchief will embrace the role of Dragonborn. While he isn't convinced that an orc would be the prophesized hero, he won't pass up the chance to fight dragons and test his mettle. He will side with the Dawnguard in the Dawnguard DLC, as the vampires make for worthy adversaries, and he would never subject himself to becoming a vampire. He will complete the Dragonborn DLC and he will join the Companions, although he sees lycanthropy as a dishonest means for growing stronger. He believes he can be the most powerful warrior without the unnatural assistance. Even though the Stormcloaks are relatively unsympathetic towards other races, the Orc Warchief will be attracted to them as the Lords of High Rock he despised as a youth were representatives of the Imperial Legion. He hopes that assisting the Stormcloaks in their civil war will impact the bigoted Lords of High Rock in some way. With his backstory, roleplaying and factions in mind, let's see what that means for his skills, spells, perks, and overall playstyle. The main skills for the Orc Warchief will be two-handed, block, heavy armor, smithing, and enchanting. He is no mage and relies solely on his strength and skill with melee weapons and armor to get the upper hand in combat, so let's skip straight into the essential perks. While most 14-year-olds in Tamriel were only just learning to wield a cheap iron dagger, the Orc Warchief was executing momentous swings and strikes with his warhammer. Evidently, the two-handed skill is one he excels in. From this skill tree, we suggest taking the middle branch up to sweep. The Orc Warchief makes a hobby of playing croquet with his hammer and the heads of his foes. As he'll be doing a lot of power attacks and bashes in quick succession, stamina is always important. And with champion stance, power attacks with two-handed weapons cost 25% less stamina. The Orc Warchief is an aggressive fighter. He puts faith in his ability to break down his adversaries' defenses before they can do the same to him. For this reason, and so he can take advantage of his immense strength, he doesn't waste one arm holding a shield. But that doesn't mean he can't block incoming blows. The Warchief uses the haft of his mighty hammer to parry blows and tear down defenses. As a result, investing in the block skill is perfect for his playstyle. From this skill tree, you should take the right hand branch up to disarming bash, as well as taking quick reflexes. The two above mentioned perks are fantastic against all melee opponents. With disarming bash, the Warchief can disarm opponents with his power bashes, and thanks to quick reflexes, you'll have the maneuverability and time to get the most out of all of these strikes. With quick reflexes, time will slow down if you are blocking while an enemy performs a power attack. It's pretty clear that the Orc Warchief is unbelievably strong. He plows headlong into the fray and believes subtlety should be left to the Khajiit. As a result, you'll never see him messing around in light armor. The Warchief wears the heaviest, most formidable armor he can get his hands on. From the heavy armor skill tree, you'll want to take everything from the left branch and then everything up to Tower of Strength on the right branch. A vital pick from this tree is conditioning, which removes any weight from heavy armor and prevents it from slowing the wearer down. If the Warchief is going to be dodging attacks with his quick reflexes, high mobility in his armor can't be taken too lightly, so to speak. Secondly, the Tower of Strength perk befits the Warchief, as it removes 50% of stagger when wearing only heavy armor. The Orc Warchief isn't the kind of guy who stumbles when a pitiful bandit comes his way. Next up, we have the smithing skill. In his tribal days, living in the High Rock stronghold, the Orc Warchief was taught to value his tools and equipment as they were key to his survival. His armor would always keep him safe, while his weapons would hold off attackers and allow him to hunt his food. Therefore, the Warchief is no stranger to maintaining and improving his arsenal at the forge. From the smithing skill tree, we recommend taking everything except for glass and dragon smithing. The key ingredients here are advanced armors, Daedric smithing, and arcane blacksmith. Advanced armors means the Warchief will be able to improve his helm of Ingol. Daedric smithing will allow him to improve his ancient Nordic armor, and finally, arcane blacksmith will work hand in hand with his final skill, which is enchanting. With enchanting, the Orc Warchief will learn to get the most out of his equipment. From this skill tree, you'll want to go for the middle branch up to extra effect. Enchanting in general is incredibly useful for any build, and with extra effect, you'll be able to put 2 enchantments on every piece of armor, jewelry, and weapon you use. With those skills and perks in mind, let's talk playstyle. The Orc Warchief will play ultra aggressive. He'll charge into battle, bashing foes with his hammer, using the block bash mechanic to break down their defenses, and following it up with a barrage of power attacks. Thanks to a number of perks, some enchantments, and the unique effect of his hammer, you won't need to worry about burning through your stamina quickly. The Orc Warchief embraces his awesome background to strike fear into his opponents however he can. One way he does this is simply through his sheer size and power, but another is through his choice of apparel. The Warchief will be fully decked out in the Northern Tundra aesthetic with the ancient Nordic armor, and that will be topped off with the horned helmet known as the Helm of Ingol. Combined with his hereditary orc tusks, the Warchief could be mistaken for a dangerous prehistoric beast. Until you can get your mitts on these armor pieces, a complete set of orcish armor works just perfectly. Keep in mind that with enchanting, putting 2 enchantments on each piece of armor, plus a ring and a necklace of your choice, makes a world of difference. We suggest using enchantments like Fortify Two-Handed, Fortify Stamina, and Fortify Block. As for his weapon choice, the Orc Warchief will use the unique Warhammer Volendrum, which also happens to be the Daedric artifact of Malakath. This weapon absorbs a massive 50 points of stamina on top of its already impressive 25 base damage. That stamina regen, as we touched on in the playstyle, is critical for the Warchief's hard and fast approach. For a detailed guide on how to find this wicked Warhammer, check out our Good Pal Camelworks channel, where you'll be able to find this guide plus many more awesome Elder Scrolls weapon and armor guides. Once again, the link to his channel can be found just below in the description. Until you can begin the quest for this weapon at level 10, any Warhammer will work just fine. Give that like button a whack if you enjoyed the video, guys, because that concludes this week's Skyrim Remastered build, the Orc Warchief. If you're not already on board, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for the very best Elder Scrolls content. Head on down to the description where you'll be able to find timestamps for video navigation, as well as links to all our social media profiles. Lastly, don't forget to cast your vote in the comments for which build we remaster next. This time your choices are the Shield Maiden and the Monster Hunter, so get voting. But there you have it, folks. Thank you as always for watching. I've been Drew, this has been FudgeMuppet, and I look forward to nerding out with you again in the next one.